On May 23, 1982, a 13-year-old girl in Cloverdale, California, left her friend's house on a Sunday evening and headed downtown on foot. It was a short walk. She had done it before. She never arrived. A stain on the clothing she wore that night sat unexamined for over 20 years. Her name was Sarah Geer. She was born on February 13, 1969, and lived with her family in Cloverdale, a wine country town of about 8,000 people at the northern tip of the Alexander Valley, 90 miles north of San Francisco. Vineyards on the hillsides, dirt roads between properties and neighbors who knew each other. Sarah was finishing 7th grade at Washington School. She had friends. She had a whole summer ahead of her. On May 23rd, she was spending the day at a friend's house. Memorial Day weekend. Sometime in the early evening, she left to walk downtown. The route was familiar and short. In a town like Cloverdale in 1982, no one would have thought twice about a teenager making that walk alone. She never made it. The following morning, a Cloverdale fireman walking home after his overnight shift found her body near an alley off a residential street. He had been heading home from work. He came across a dead 13-year-old instead. Investigators pieced together what happened. According to prosecutors and the evidence later presented at trial, James Unick, a man in his mid-20s at the time, intercepted Sarah near an alley not far from where she had set out. He forced her down that alley into a secluded area behind a fence, adjacent to an apartment building, out of sight from the road. He raped her and strangled her to death. He used her own shorts as the ligature. Then he left. He went back to his life. That afternoon, and everything that came with it disappeared behind 44 years of ordinary living. The Cloverdale Police Department launched a homicide investigation. Investigators worked the scene, collected evidence, and interviewed people in the area. The case drew enough early attention to be treated seriously. According to those who later spoke to reporters, Sarah Geer was, to the best of anyone's recollection, the very first homicide victim in Cloverdale's history. The city's first murder victim was a girl in 7th grade. Investigators did everything available to them with the technology that 1982 provided. Forensic DNA analysis did not yet exist as an investigative tool. There were no fingerprints. There were no witnesses to the attack itself. No one saw anything that held up under scrutiny. By the end of the year, the case had stalled. The physical evidence, including Sarah's clothing from that night, was sealed and placed into long-term storage at the Cloverdale Police Department. The file went onto a shelf. Cloverdale is a small town. Sarah's family stayed. The people who knew her stayed. The absence was not something that faded into the background. The case sat without movement for years, then decades. Detectives who worked it moved on. New detectives came in and reviewed the file and found nothing to grab onto. The trail had been cold from the start. There were no concrete suspects, no forensic connections, no witnesses who had seen anything useful. Year after year, the file produced nothing. In 2003, 21 years after the murder, investigators submitted the preserved clothing to a crime lab for modern testing. A DNA profile was developed from biological material found on the evidence. For the first time, investigators had a genetic fingerprint of Sarah's killer. They ran it through coldest, the FBI's national database of DNA profiles collected from convicted offenders. No match came back. Whoever left the DNA had either never been convicted of a qualifying offense or had been processed before mandatory DNA collection laws applied. The profile was entered into the database and left to run automatically against every new entry added going forward. Year after year, no match came back. Sarah's family kept calling. They kept asking. They received updates that amounted to nothing changing. Both of Sarah's parents died without learning who killed their daughter. In 2021, the Cloverdale Police Department enlisted the FBI and retained a private investigator named Kevin Kline to push the case forward using tools that hadn't existed in 1982 or even in 2003. What they were after specifically was investigative genetic genealogy, the same technique that had been used to identify the Golden State Killer in 2018 and had since become one of the primary methods for cracking cold cases with unmatched DNA profiles. The technique works on a different principle than CODIS. Instead of running the unknown DNA against convicted offenders, investigators upload the profile to public ancestry platforms where millions of ordinary people have voluntarily submitted their DNA to trace family history. If anyone in those databases shares enough DNA with the unknown contributor, it signals a biological relationship. Genealogists then build family trees from those distant matches, working backward through births, marriages, deaths, and relocations using public records until they've narrowed down which branch of the family, and eventually which individual, is the likely source of the crime scene DNA. It is slow, methodical work. It can take months. When it works, it produces what no traditional database can: a name attached to an unknown profile. The FBI's work identified a family. Within that family, 4 brothers emerged as candidates. One of them was James Oliver Unick. He was by this point in his early 60s. He had been living in Willows, California, a small agricultural town in Glenn County a couple of hours north of the Bay Area. He had been there for years. His name had never appeared in the original case file. Genealogy work identifies candidates. It doesn't confirm them. Investigators needed a direct DNA sample from Unick, collected without his knowledge, so he couldn't prepare for what was coming. FBI agents put him under surveillance. They watched him go about his daily routine. At some point, he smoked a cigarette and dropped it. Agents collected the discarded butt and submitted it to the lab. The analysis came back. Unick's DNA from the cigarette matched the profile developed from Sarah's clothing in 2003. It also matched DNA recovered from multiple individual articles of her clothing from the night of the murder. Multiple matches, across multiple pieces of evidence that had been sitting in storage for over 40 years. In July 2024, law enforcement went to Unick's home in Willows. He was 62 years old. They arrested him on charges of murder, kidnapping, rape, and lewd and lascivious acts against a minor under 14 by force. When detectives questioned him, he said he had no recollection of May 23, 1982, not a denial with specifics, no alibi, no alternative account of his whereabouts. Just no recollection of the night his DNA ended up on a dead 13-year-old girl's clothing in an alley in Cloverdale. He was held without bail. The trial opened in late January 2026 in Sonoma County Superior Court before Judge Laura Pasaglia. Deputy District Attorneys Christina Stevens and Alex Fisher prosecuted, with support from DA investigator Dave Call. The proceedings ran for a month. Witnesses included childhood friends of Sarah's, people who had been teenagers the last time they saw her, who were now in their mid-50s, who had spent their entire adult lives carrying the memory of that weekend. They testified. They came to court for her 4 decades after she died. Then Unick took the stand. He told the jury he had been at the Cloverdale arcade that evening, playing video games. He said Sarah approached him and propositioned him for sex. He said they went together to a hillside near the Russian River, and that the encounter was consensual. He said he left and that some other man, unnamed, unidentifiable, leaving no DNA or any other physical evidence, must have committed the actual crime. The prosecution called the account fictitious. A dead 13-year-old girl, pulled back into a courtroom 4 decades after her murder, accused by the man who killed her of having initiated what happened. His DNA on multiple articles of her clothing, attributed to a consensual encounter. The murder itself, attributed to a phantom. The jury deliberated for approximately 2 hours. On February 13, 2026, the day Sarah Geer would have turned 57 years old, the verdict was returned. Guilty of murder. Special circumstance, sexual assault. Special circumstance, rape. Audience members in the courtroom let out audible gasps and exhales as the verdict was read. Unick lowered his face into his hand. Several people in attendance said happy birthday to Sarah, the girl murdered in 1982, whose birthday it would have been, who had waited 44 years for this. District Attorney Carla Rodriguez said in her statement, "While 44 years is too long to wait, justice has finally been served." That phrase, "while 44 years is too long to wait," carries the full weight of the case. It is an acknowledgement that the delay was real and that it cost the family everything they should have had. It is also a statement that the delay didn't end the pursuit. James Oliver Unick was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Sarah Geer was 13 years old. She left her friend's house on a Sunday evening to walk downtown. According to investigators, she was the first homicide victim in Cloverdale's history. Both of her parents died without answers. Her family spent 44 years making calls to the sheriff's office, showing up when the case was discussed publicly, refusing to let it disappear. On what would have been her 57th birthday, a jury found her killer guilty. The conviction stands. He will die in prison. And the people in that courtroom said her name. If you've watched this far, subscribe, like, and leave a comment, and drop a word or two for Sarah's family.